For 15 long years, one fingerprint sat forgotten inside a dusty evidence box, a single silent clue to a child's disappearance that had shaken an entire community. Detectives had searched every lead, interviewed countless witnesses, and chased shadows that led nowhere. But when new forensic technology finally re-examined that print, it uncovered a chilling truth. The man responsible had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, trusted by many, and watching as the case grew cold. Freya Harris was a bright and cheerful 9-year-old girl who lived with her parents in a small, close-knit town. She was known for her warm smile, her love for stuffed animals, and the little blue jacket she wore everywhere, no matter the season. Her favorite toy was a small penguin she carried in her backpack. Everyone who knew her said she had a gentle spirit and made friends easily. In September 1997, her family decided to spend the evening at the annual county fair. For Freya, this was the most exciting night of the year. The fair was filled with music, laughter, and the smell of popcorn. Families walked together, children played games, and colorful lights lit up the night sky. Freya held her father's hand tightly as they moved through the crowd. Her mother carried a bag of cotton candy that Freya had begged for all week. At one point during the evening, the family stopped near a game booth. Freya's father let go of her hand for just a moment to pay for tickets, and her mother turned to get napkins. When they turned back, Freya was gone. At first, they assumed she had wandered a few steps away. She was a curious child, and it wasn't unusual for kids to get distracted by balloons, music, or other children. But within seconds, their light-hearted search turned to panic. Her parents called her name again and again, their voices growing louder each time. Other fairgoers joined in, helping to look for the little girl in the blue jacket. Announcements were made over the loudspeakers. Security guards and volunteers began checking the nearby rides, food stalls, and restrooms. Minutes felt like hours. As time passed, fear spread through the crowd. Parents clutched their own children a little tighter. Freya's father ran from booth to booth, showing people her picture, asking if anyone had seen her. Her mother stood near the spot where they last saw her, crying and begging for help. Local police were called almost immediately. They quickly set up a search perimeter around the fairgrounds. Officers, fair staff, and volunteers combed through every corner of the area. They searched parking lots, nearby fields, and even dumpsters, hoping for any sign of Freya. Helicopters were brought in, and dogs were used to track her scent. Despite the massive search, Freya was nowhere to be found. No one had seen her walk away with a stranger, and there were no clear witnesses who could describe what happened in those crucial moments. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The fair, once full of joy and laughter, turned silent and tense. What was supposed to be a night of family fun became the beginning of every parent's worst nightmare. As the hours stretched into the night, hope began to mix with fear. Her family refused to leave, standing by the gates long after the fair had closed, waiting for her to come back. This night would change their lives forever. It marked the beginning of a mystery that would remain unsolved for many years. A mystery that started with a moment's distraction and ended in heartbreaking silence. After Freya's disappearance in 1997, investigators searched for months, following every possible lead. They interviewed hundreds of people who were at the fair that night. They checked local offenders, ran background checks on employees, and followed up on tips from across the state. But each lead either turned into a dead end or wasn't strong enough to move the case forward. Over time, the investigation slowed. Detectives moved on to other cases, and the evidence collected that night, including fingerprints, witness reports, and physical items, was carefully packed away in storage. Freya's parents kept in constant contact with the police, calling for updates, but as months turned into years, those calls grew quieter. Eventually, the case became what's known as a cold case, a case that remains unsolved for a long period of time with no new evidence to work on. Even though it was no longer active, the file on Freya's disappearance was never forgotten. In the years that followed, new detectives would occasionally review the case to see if fresh eyes could spot something that others might have missed. But the reality was harsh. Technology in the late 1990s wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. Investigators didn't have access to the kinds of DNA databases and modern fingerprint systems that exist now. Many pieces of evidence that were collected were kept in storage, waiting for a time when they might be more useful. By 2012, 15 years had passed. Freya's parents still lived in the same house, holding on to hope that one day they would get answers. Detectives in the department had changed over the years. Some had retired, others had been promoted, but the memory of Freya's case lingered in the minds of many. That year, the police department launched a special project to review old unsolved cases using updated technology. Cold case detectives began pulling files from storage, re-examining evidence, and checking whether modern forensic methods could uncover new leads. Freya's case was one of the first to be reviewed. Detectives opened the boxes of evidence collected back in 1997. Inside were photographs, reports, clothing, personal items, and fingerprints taken from various places around the fairgrounds. One of these items was a partial fingerprint lifted from a trash can located not far from where Freya was last seen. At the time, this fingerprint had been run through the local system but didn't match anyone in their records. With the technology available back then, that was as far as they could go. Now, with improved national fingerprint databases and more sensitive scanning equipment, that same print could be analyzed again in far greater detail. Detectives submitted it for a new check, not expecting much. After so many years, most cold cases rarely produced new results. But this time, something was different. Within weeks, the fingerprint system returned a match. It was linked to a man who had once worked at the fair as a security guard, someone who had been overlooked in the original investigation. This discovery didn't solve the case immediately, but it gave detectives something they hadn't had in 15 years, a solid lead. For Freya's family, it was the first glimmer of hope in a very long time. The cold case was no longer cold. A fingerprint that had sat untouched for over a decade had just opened a new chapter in the investigation. The fingerprint match from the cold case review led detectives to a man named Thomas Reed. In 1997, he had worked part-time as a security guard at the county fair. At the time, Thomas was 28 years old, quiet, and kept mostly to himself. He had no serious criminal record back then, just a few minor issues, nothing that raised any alarms during the original investigation. When detectives looked into his past, they discovered that Thomas had left town shortly after the fair ended that year. He moved from state to state, working short-term security jobs and disappearing again before anyone got to know him too well. Over the years, he had been arrested for small offenses like trespassing and disorderly conduct, but nothing that ever connected him to violent crimes. Because his fingerprint hadn't been in the national system at the time of Freya's disappearance, investigators in 1997 had no way to match it. Now in 2012, with improved fingerprint databases, the partial print found on the trash can came back as a clear match to Thomas Reed. Detectives dug deeper into his history, and what they found raised serious suspicions. During the fair in 1997, Thomas had been assigned to patrol the outer edges of the fairgrounds near the parking lot, the restrooms, and the game booths. That area was not heavily monitored, especially after dark. Witness statements from back then mentioned seeing a man in a security uniform near the spot where Freya disappeared, but no one could give a clear description. At the time, investigators assumed it was just another guard doing his job. Detectives also learned that Thomas had abruptly quit his job the morning after Freya went missing. He didn't pick up his final paycheck, didn't return his uniform, and left town without notice. At the time, this was seen as suspicious, but not enough to arrest him. Without physical evidence, there was little they could do. Now, with the fingerprint evidence, detectives had a reason to reopen his file. They began tracking him down. It wasn't easy. Thomas had moved frequently, leaving behind little trace. But after weeks of work, they found him living in a small town several hundred miles away. He was working at a warehouse under his real name and living alone. Detectives reviewed surveillance, gathered information quietly, and eventually brought him in for questioning. At first, Thomas acted calm and cooperative. He claimed he didn't remember much about the fair in 1997. He said thousands of people were there, and if his fingerprint was found on a trash can, it was probably because he was working in that area that night. But detectives noticed small details in his behavior: nervous tapping, avoiding eye contact when Freya's name was mentioned, and inconsistencies in his timeline. When asked why he quit his job the next morning, he gave vague answers, saying he needed to move on and had other things to do. The questioning didn't lead to a confession, but it gave detectives something crucial: a clear person of interest. For the first time in 15 years, they had someone to focus on. Thomas Reed was no longer just a name in an old file. He was now the center of a renewed investigation that could finally bring answers to a family who had waited far too long. After identifying Thomas Reed as the main suspect, detectives knew they needed more than just a fingerprint on a trash can to solve Freya Harris's disappearance. A single print could place him at the fair, but it wasn't enough to prove involvement in a kidnapping or anything worse. They needed strong physical evidence that could link him directly to the crime. The first step was to go back to the original evidence boxes stored since 1997. Over the years, these boxes had been carefully preserved in a temperature-controlled evidence room. Inside were items collected from the fairgrounds, witness statements, clothing, and other objects from that night. Among these items was Freya's little blue jacket, the one she was wearing when she disappeared. It had been found a few days after the fair, lying in a ditch several miles from the fairgrounds. At the time, forensic technology was limited. Investigators had checked it for fibers and visible clues but couldn't get any DNA results. Now, with modern forensic methods, this jacket could hold answers. Detectives sent the jacket to a state-of-the-art crime lab for advanced testing. Using new techniques, forensic experts carefully examined the fabric for touch DNA, tiny skin cells that can be left behind from a brief contact. This method wasn't available in the 1990s, but now it had the power to reveal new details from old evidence. Weeks later, the results came back. Technicians had found a partial DNA profile on the collar and sleeve of Freya's jacket. This DNA was compared against the national database, and it matched Thomas Reed. The chance of the DNA belonging to someone else was incredibly small. But that wasn't all. Detectives also revisited a storage unit Thomas had once rented years after the disappearance. When they tracked down the old unit's records, they discovered that the unit had been cleared out after Thomas failed to make payments. Some of the contents had been auctioned off, but a few unclaimed boxes remained in storage. Investigators got a warrant to search through these items. Inside one of the dusty boxes, they found several objects that raised eyebrows: old fair security badges, uniforms, and personal belongings from the late 1990s. Most of it seemed harmless, until they came across a small stuffed penguin. This penguin toy was identical to the one Freya had carried with her everywhere. Her parents had described it in detail back in 1997, down to the tiny red bow around its neck. Investigators compared photographs from the original case file and confirmed it was the exact same toy. Finding Freya's toy in Thomas Reed's stored belongings was a powerful piece of evidence. It directly connected him to her in a way that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. Additionally, forensic experts examined the stuffed toy and discovered traces of Freya's DNA on it even after all these years. This was a major breakthrough. It meant that at some point on the night she disappeared, her toy ended up in Thomas Reed's possession, something he had never mentioned in any of his statements. With both the DNA on the jacket and the toy found in his old storage unit, detectives finally had physical evidence strong enough to move forward. The mood inside the investigation room changed. For years, this case had been filled with dead ends and unanswered questions. Now, for the first time, the evidence was starting to tell a clear story, one that placed Thomas Reed directly in the center of Freya Harris's disappearance. Freya's parents were called in and gently informed about the new findings. It was emotional and overwhelming for them. After years of waiting, hoping, and fearing, they were hearing real updates, the kind that could finally bring the truth to light. The evidence recovered after 15 long years had reignited the case in a way no one expected. What once seemed unsolvable was now on the verge of a major breakthrough. Once the forensic lab confirmed the DNA match on Freya's jacket and the stuffed penguin was found in Thomas Reed's old storage unit, detectives knew they finally had enough evidence to act. The case that had remained unsolved for 15 years was now moving quickly. An arrest warrant was issued for Thomas Reed. On a quiet morning, detectives and local officers surrounded his small house. He was taken by surprise as he stepped outside for work holding his coffee. He didn't resist arrest, but his face showed a mix of confusion and fear as officers placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. Neighbors watched from their porches, shocked to see police cars lining the street for a man they thought was quiet and ordinary. Thomas was brought to the police station and placed in an interrogation room. The room was plain, just a table, 2 chairs, and a small recording camera in the corner. 2 detectives entered, one who had been working the cold case review and another who specialized in interrogations. At first, Thomas acted calm. He tried to downplay the situation, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding. He admitted working at the fair in 1997, but denied knowing anything about Freya's disappearance. He said the DNA on the jacket must have been transferred while he was doing security rounds. But detectives didn't confront him right away. Instead, they let him talk, allowing him to give his version of events. They knew that the more he spoke, the more likely he was to slip up. After a while, one of the detectives slowly placed the photograph of the stuffed penguin on the table. The toy had been a treasured item of Freya's, something only her family and investigators had known in detail. When Thomas saw the picture, his calm expression faltered for the first time. Detectives explained that the toy had been found in his old storage unit. They told him about the DNA results from the jacket. They laid out the timeline piece by piece, showing how the evidence connected back to him. Thomas grew defensive. He claimed someone must have planted the toy. He said he didn't remember owning it and accused the detectives of trying to frame him. But the more he tried to explain, the more tangled his answers became. He couldn't give a clear reason why he quit his job the day after Freya vanished. He couldn't explain why her DNA was found on her jacket along with his. Detectives pressed further. They reminded him that this case had never been forgotten, that a little girl's family had waited for answers for years. They spoke gently but firmly, telling him this was his chance to tell the truth. Hours passed. The pressure in the room grew heavier. Thomas shifted in his chair, wiped sweat from his forehead, and avoided eye contact. Eventually, his defensive tone softened. He admitted that he had spoken to Freya near the game booths that night, but insisted he only helped her find her parents. Detectives knew this was the first crack in his story. Bit by bit, they pushed him to explain more. They showed him evidence, timelines, and statements. Though Thomas didn't give a full confession, he admitted being alone with Freya near the back of the fairgrounds, a place that was dimly lit and less crowded. This admission, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, was enough. By the end of the interrogation, Thomas Reed was officially charged with kidnapping and murder. The case that had gone cold for more than a decade was now headed toward trial. News of the arrest spread quickly through the town. For many residents, it brought back painful memories of that night in 1997. For Freya's family, it was emotional. A mix of relief that someone had finally been held accountable, and sorrow for the years they had lived without answers. Detectives walked out of the station that night, knowing the hardest part of the mystery was finally over. They had their suspect, the evidence, and now the beginning of justice. The arrest of Thomas Reed marked a turning point in a case that had haunted the community for more than 15 years. But for Freya Harris's family, this was just the beginning of another emotional journey, the long path through the justice system. The trial began the following year. By then, prosecutors had spent months carefully building their case. They gathered every piece of physical evidence, every old witness statement, and every new forensic report. The DNA found on Freya's jacket, the stuffed penguin recovered from Thomas's storage unit, and his own statements during interrogation became the foundation of the case against him. In court, Freya's family sat quietly in the front row, just a few feet away from the man accused of taking their daughter. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local residents, and people who remembered the night she vanished. The case had touched many lives over the years, and everyone wanted to see justice served. Prosecutors began by walking the jury through the events of 1997, the fair, the disappearance, and the years that followed with no answers. They then presented the fingerprint match, the DNA evidence, and the toy that connected Thomas Reed to Freya. Expert witnesses explained how modern forensic technology had made it possible to uncover evidence that couldn't be detected back then. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Thomas's fingerprint could have ended up on the trash can through his job, and that the toy could have been misplaced or misidentified. They painted him as a man with a troubled but non-violent past. But the scientific evidence spoke louder than any argument. The DNA found on Freya's jacket was an undeniable match. The penguin toy, described in detail by her parents back in 1997, was found in his belongings years later, and his own inconsistent statements during interrogation had weakened his defense further. Throughout the trial, Freya's parents remained composed. They had waited so long for this moment. Every piece of testimony brought back painful memories, but it also moved them closer to the truth. After weeks of testimony and emotional closing arguments, the jury deliberated. The courtroom was silent when the jury returned to deliver their verdict, guilty on all major charges, including kidnapping and murder. Thomas Reed showed little reaction as the sentence was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time in over 15 years, Freya's family felt a weight begin to lift. Justice had finally been served. In the months following the trial, the community came together to honor Freya's memory. A memorial was built at the fairgrounds, near the spot where she was last seen, with a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Freya Harris, never forgotten." Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, candles were lit and her story was told again, not as a mystery, but as a reminder of resilience, hope, and the power of never giving up. For Freya's parents, closure didn't mean forgetting. The pain of losing their daughter would always remain, but they finally had answers. They finally knew the truth. After years of sleepless nights, desperate searching, and endless waiting, they could look back knowing that justice had been found, not through luck but through dedication, perseverance, and the advances in forensic science. Detectives who had worked on the case, both past and present, gathered with the family after the trial. Many admitted that Freya's disappearance had stayed with them throughout their careers. Solving it had become personal. When the verdict was announced, some of them quietly shed tears, knowing they had finally brought peace to a family that had waited far too long. This case stood as a powerful reminder that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be found. Cold cases can be reopened, evidence can speak years later, and justice, though delayed, can still arrive. For the Harris family, the courtroom's final words marked not just the end of a case, but the beginning of healing. Freya Harris's story is a powerful reminder that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be found. What began as a joyful family night at a local fair turned into years of pain, unanswered questions, and relentless searching. But through determination, modern forensic science, and the commitment of investigators, the truth finally came to light. Stories like this show us the importance of never giving up on those who disappear, no matter how cold the trail may seem. Every detail, every piece of evidence, and every unanswered question matters. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more real-life cases that were solved after years of silence, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring more attention to these stories and keeps the memories of victims alive. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay informed, and remember, every case deserves to be told.